This is a WYMT Mountain News special presentation. The 1957 flood, 50 years later.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Hensley. Recently, we marked a dark anniversary in eastern Kentucky. On January 29, 1957, several people died and scores of homes and businesses were damaged or destroyed by floodwaters. During the next half hour, we're going to re-air a special series on the 1957 flood 50 years later. We'll also talk to Jim Caldwell about forecasting floods and show you more incredible footage from 1957 that you haven't seen. Now let's turn back the clock and remember a terrible but important part of our history. If you were living in eastern Kentucky in 1957, you probably remember January 29th just like you would November 22nd, 1963.
Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
Or September 11th, 2001.
There's another one. Another plane just hit. Right. Oh, my God.
50 years ago, much of eastern Kentucky was underwater.
Mountain floods spread across 4 states, inundating scores of towns in the southern Appalachian area of Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Hardest hit was Kentucky, first of the stricken states to be declared a major disaster area by President Eisenhower. Throughout the flood area, martial law was imposed to prevent looting. It was one of the most disastrous floods ever to strike the eastern United States, leaving tens of thousands homeless, wreaking damage estimated in the millions.
This is a rare look at what it was like in downtown Hazard during the flood. The devastation was captured on a home movie camera by 21-year-old Jim Siner, who at age 71 now lives in Florida.
I was taking still pictures and movies all at the same time. And it was so funny, though, because every time I'd go from one end of town to the other, the scene had changed, as you can tell in the movies. The scenes had changed because the water just kept getting higher and higher and higher. People says, I just can't believe this. I just can't believe this much water.
According to the National Weather Service, only a little over 8 inches of precipitation fell in Hazard in January, but almost half of that was in 3 days. Many people were unprepared for the high water and lost everything.
Well, everybody thought that when the river started up, it would just come up so far, then that'd be it. Well, it just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming.
We just never dreamed that water would come up that far.
Pat Cornett was just one of many that was forced out of their homes.
It was the scariest time. I have never experienced anything like that in my lifetime.
The last thing we moved out was a deep freeze, and we had to float it out.
Fred Stidham was in high school when the flood wiped out a row of power company camp houses in Lothair.
Their home was washed off the foundation and wrapped around a maple tree that was in the yard.
Rivers and streams were out of their banks everywhere. The flood stage in Hazard is 21 feet. The North Fork of the Kentucky River crested at about 37.5 feet. It's never been higher before or since. There was no electricity, little food, and communication with the outside world was cut off. Residents could only watch in horror as lives were ruined.
There were inventories of the stores on Main Street and refrigerators still in their crates and stoves and parts of people's houses, and just everything that you could imagine was floating down that river, and it was going very, very fast, and the sound was just so eerie.
The smells, the sounds of that are still with me.
For Martha Quigley and many others, the pain lasted long after the waters receded.
Seeing that river that high gave me a recurring nightmare that I had for many, many, many years after that. I really believe that that was something that was so traumatic that it just stayed with me.
As we mentioned, the home movie of the flood, along with many of the pictures in this series, were provided by Jim Siner, who says at the time he had no idea how significant it would become. Well, one of the most unbelievable things that happened during the 1957 flood in Perry County was actually in the sky. As we continue our trip down memory lane, Hear why some people dropped to their knees in prayer, thinking it could be the end of time. Just after darkness fell on the flooded streets of Hazard on January 29, 1957, something happened that turned night into day.
It wasn't just like in one part of the sky. It just lightened up the whole town.
Well, we just knew this was the end of time, and as I understand, everybody that saw it thought it was the end of time as well. We had no idea what had happened.
Tommy Bailey says what happened was a log floating down the river hit an oil circuit breaker at the Kentucky power plant in Lothair. At only 17, Bailey was the secretary for the district manager of the power company.
There had never been anything like this before or since.
While some were looking at the sky, others were trying to reach anyone they could find for help.
We just sit here and hovered over this for about the first 2 hours.
Bill Roll and a friend disconnected an emergency power unit from the Hazard Civil Air Patrol mobile broadcasting vehicle and attached it to a transmitter. Finally, someone heard him in Atlanta, and Hazard was no longer isolated from the world.
We got messages from different people to send different things in here. Bulldozers, cots, blankets, water, just anything that could help us, because we knew it'd be a few days before anybody came in.
4 days later, over 400 messages had been sent out of Hazard by shortwave radio. Elizabeth Duncan was also on the airwaves. She drove her young child and another family member to Monticello after the flood, while her husband Joe cleaned up the Hazard Rexall store they operated for decades on Main Street.
And then they asked me to be on the radio in Monticello and tell them what I knew about it and make an appeal for help. And they really came through.
While the devastation was tremendous, the death toll was fairly low. Many people in Hazard remember Mac Hill, who drowned while trying to save 2 women stranded in an office building. A few other deaths were reported across the region, and some say the timing of the flood lowered the number of fatalities.
It could have been worse. It could have come during the night and we would have all been dead. As fast as the water was coming up, we would have been caught in the water.
There were also a few lighter moments during the flood. The sign on the Virginia Theater marquee in Hazard shows one movie playing was ironically called Away All Boats. And then there's this.
And there was a 200-pound hog on top of a filing cabinet inside the offices of the power company.
Here's the picture to prove it. Even this pig somehow managed to find higher ground. Days after the flood, Kentucky Governor Happy Chandler estimated the damage across the region at $1 billion. Well, there's much more to come as we remember the 1957 flood 50 years later. Up next, a look at how some Eastern Kentuckians came together to clean up and put their lives back together after the flood. Stay with us. Welcome back. 50 years after the Great Flood of '57, people not only remember the high water, but the incredible destruction that was left behind.
When it reaches the floor of the bridge, that means there's 30 feet of water in the North Fork of the Kentucky River. Look at it now, how low. It's amazing to think that it could come up that fast.
Former Hazard Mayor Bill Morton lived through several floods while working at Home Lumber Company. But when the '57 flood hit, he was actually at Ohio State University taking a course. When he heard about what was going on, he immediately came home, but that was easier said than done.
It was very difficult to get here. We couldn't come up Kentucky 15. It was flooded all the way from Clay City, Campton, and so we had to drive down through London and Hyden and come in that way.
And what he found when he got home was a big mess.
It had 7 feet and 2 inches of flood water throughout the lumberyard.
This is what Main Street in Hazard looked like just after the flood. Every business was damaged.
It came up so fast, we didn't expect it to. We didn't have time to do very much. We lost pretty near everything we had in the basement.
Joe Duncan operated Rexall Drug, and like many others, he says Hazard pulled together like never before during its darkest days.
Everybody pitched in and worked like Trojans, and Getting rid of the mud was the big thing before it got hard.
The American Red Cross and National Guard arrived with much-needed help. Schools were turned into shelters and local churches fed thousands of people. Hazard Mayor Bill Gorman's mother even headed the Red Cross chapter in town.
Every single person in this community, little kids, everybody worked in order to clean up after the flood. We live in a country of amazing people, and they're good people.
There were also many health concerns after the flood. Sue Logan worked for the Perry County Health Department at the time. She says there were more than 120 active cases of TB in only one part of the county when the flood hit. Logan and others put their own problems aside and went back to work immediately to treat everything from the common cold to outbreaks of hepatitis.
We held huge mass typhoid clinics, and I don't know how many hundreds that we, immunized.
You might think your faith would be tested during such a terrible time, but most people I talked with said it was just the opposite.
When that happened and we sort of got back on our feet again and my dad was able to go back to work, my mother told us kids, she said, "Didn't I tell you that God would take care of it?"
Hazard came back, and they'll continue to go back.
WYMT Chief Weathercaster Jim Caldwell joins me now. And Jim, a lot of people that I interviewed for this series told me that the way they got their weather forecast 50 years ago was simply walk out the door and look up at the sky. We've come a long way since then.
We have come a long way since then, and that's probably the truth. That's the only option they really had. You think of how just the televisions and homes have grown through the years, and even radios back then, not so common, but weather technology has also came a long way here in southeastern Kentucky and across the U.S. At that time, there weren't many radars around, and the radars they were using were based on 1940s technology, and we didn't have many around here. Now we've kind of changed things up a little bit. We have that, what you're seeing, the WSR 88D. That's just the technical name for it. That's the Doppler radar, and it's what you see in a newscast every day. You can find it all over the internet now. There's 155 sites now protecting the people of the United States and some of the other territories that belong to the U.S. Also, you see this? The National Weather Service was also implemented due to a flood. That came in the 1970s. It's something eastern Kentucky needed for a long time due to our rugged terrain and the way our creeks and streams can fill up so easily due to that, Steve. We were then given a National Weather Service to protect this area. Technology has also came a long, long way with the radar and also with the forecasting models. Back then, they had to draw things out by hand. Now we've got so many things at our disposal that we just basically take advantage of because there are just so many things we can look at, so many other little items we've got for you. I mean, we've got a weather center full of computers here, a lot of stuff we can use and have access to. But one of the most important things that we always like to encourage our viewing public to hear are safety tips. You can never get too much of those. And we've got some here for you. Just remember these. With flooding, this is what you have to remember. When there's flooding potential around, if you know that you live in a flood-prone area, you want to evacuate that area and go to higher ground. A lot of people, Steve shared his family story, they all got into one house there. About 30 people or so tried to stay there. Right. Never drive across a flooded roadway. Remember, turn around, don't drown, and stay away from creeks and streams, and obviously get to the higher ground. And I was talking about some of the technology and how far it has actually been coming. Look at this map that I've got up here for you. Wow. I can say wow to that because I really understand what we're looking at. What we're seeing is precipitation totals over the next 2 days. In 1957, you didn't have that type of map. You didn't have that graphic. As generic as that looks, you didn't have that type of data at your disposal and being able to distribute out to the public like we do now via the internet. We've got our own product now on our website at WYMTnews.com called First Alert Download Weather, and it gives you anything you'd want. You can get current conditions from all across Kentucky. You can get forecast. You can get all kinds of data. And again, Doppler radar, which comes in so very handy because it estimates the intensity of the rainfall that is falling out there. 1957 technology could do it, but it couldn't even show you where it was at. Back then, they didn't have maps that a radar could be displayed on. All it was just a black screen. You can basically just a little swirling line. It would go around and show a black screen with splotches on it. And in 1957, it was in black and white. It wasn't until the 70s it came in color.
So at least, if we're facing several inches of rain, we're at least going to know about it a few days in advance, hopefully, unlike the folks in 1957.
Absolutely. It goes back to the hurricane thing. back in the 50s and beyond that, we didn't know when hurricanes were coming. Now we can see them coming days out and give everybody plenty of warning. Same thing with the weather systems that we see here every day. We can see them coming a few days in advance. Just some of the smaller stuff like the pop-up thunderstorms and the summer with flash flooding. That's one of the hardest things still to predict in the world of weather, Steve. But big-time flooding, we can do it.
Jim, thank you very much. Straight ahead, my own family's story of survival during the '57 flood. Stay with us. The 1957 flood affected everyone, including members of my own family. Now, hear their personal story of survival.
It was up to the steps and almost into the door.
My grandmother, Ernestine Hensley, calls it one of the worst nights of her life. When the river kept getting closer to the home she still lives in today, her young family, along with many others in the neighborhood, decided to move up the street to higher ground, where this house now sits near the old MC Napier High School. This picture from the 1963 flood shows the area of Darfork where this all took place.
We got a boat and we went to Wayne Davidson's house. We thought we'd be safe there. It was up on the hill a little bit.
Little did they know, things were getting ready to go from bad to worse. Sometime during the night, the house caught fire. An elderly couple, William and Elizabeth Sizemore, didn't make it out. Others tried to save them, but it was too late.
They were standing by the door with their arms around each other.
The Sizemores were buried here at Riverside Cemetery a few days after they perished in the fire just down the road. As you can see, both death dates are listed as January 29th, 1957.
Say hi, Uncle Steve.
There was almost another death that night. The last one to make it out of the fire alive was my father, who was only 9 years old. And how he got out is simply unbelievable. He says he was sound asleep on the floor when he heard a voice saying, "Doug, wake up. The house is on fire."
And I'll never forget it. Somebody was leading me through the house, and I remember seeing fire going up the walls, shooting up the walls. I remember that. And we walked right past where the fire had started and walked out on the porch, and Mom grabbed me and they were trying, I think, trying to hold her back from going in after me when they'd missed me. They hadn't found me. And she asked me how I got out, and I said that man brought me out. But of course, there wasn't anybody there. It was an angel of God that brought me out.
His hair was singed and he had some blisters on his ears, but Dad says he doesn't even remember having trouble breathing despite going through all that smoke. And while 2 people lost their lives, entire families could have easily been wiped out that night.
We could have all been killed. And just about were. But the Lord was with us.
Everyone that got out of that fire alive ended up staying at another house the rest of the night. The next day, my family was relieved to find that the water had crested just inches from the main floor of their house. And one more ironic connection between my family and the '57 disaster, my sister was born on the anniversary of the flood, January 29th. Straight ahead, a look at what's happened in the last 50 years to hopefully make sure we never see a disaster like the '57 flood again. Stay with us. Could it happen again? 50 years after the 1957 flood, officials hope we'll never see a disaster like that again thanks to various flood control projects in the last 50 years.
Let's make Middlesboro high and dry.
For more than 2 decades in Washington, Congressman Hal Rogers has made flood control one of his top priorities. He says great progress has been made, especially along the Cumberland River.
Today, I can tell you there will never again flood in Pineville, in Harlan, in Williamsburg, in Barberville, and soon in Cumberland and Middlesboro. Those towns will never flood again because of these projects that we've completed.
And they rescued us off this porch and the water finally crested at the top of the banisters.
In 1957, Paul Gordon's house was flooded and he had to be rescued by boat. He believes another big flood will come. It's just a matter of time.
Eventually we probably will have water again. You know, it's just a choice we got to live here, and eventually probably it will happen again, you know.
Officials believe one reason the North Fork of the Kentucky River has not crested above 30 feet in Hazard in more than 20 years is because of the Carr Creek Dam here in Knott County. Hazard Mayor Bill Gorman, who helped push for the Carr Creek Dam and the Buckhorn Dam, says there's no doubt flood levels are reduced. Meanwhile, flood control projects continue in other areas like the city of Martin in Floyd County, where the town is literally being moved to higher ground. Congressman Rogers says it's all worth the very high price tag.
I will not rest until every person that can be prevented from flooding is in fact safe from flooding.
2 other big mountain floods happened in years that ended in 7. April will mark the 30th anniversary of the 1977 flood, which was even worse than the 57 flood in parts of the region, and the 80th anniversary of the 1927 flood will be in May. We want to thank you for watching this special Mountain News presentation. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this show, you can find more information about that on our website at WYMTnews.com, or just give us a call here at the station at 606-436-5757 during regular business hours. We're going to leave you tonight with more of Jim Siner's incredible home movies of the 57 flood and new footage I received after the series originally aired. One of my relatives actually shot in the Lothair section of Hazard. Good night, everyone.